There was a time when I believed clarity would feel like certainty. I was wrong. Clarity feels like responsibility. After everything's settled, after roles collapsed, after identity loosened its grip, after I stopped chasing replacement meanings, life didn't become brighter. It became quieter, not empty, just unremarkable in a way that demanded attention. Nothing dramatic announced this phase. No new chapter began. No internal voice said, "This is it." Days simply continued, and I noticed that I was no longer resisting them. I woke up without the need to interpret my mood. Some mornings felt open. Others felt heavy. Neither required explanation. I had stopped asking what each feeling meant about me. That alone changed everything. The world continued at its familiar pace. Ambition everywhere. Urgency everywhere. People measuring themselves constantly against time, against others, against invisible standards. I watched without judgment and without participation. I realized that maturity doesn't feel powerful. It feels stable, and stability is not exciting. It's steady. I no longer expected life to reveal itself. I participated in it. That distinction mattered. There were still decisions to make, but they no longer felt symbolic. They were practical. Where to place my energy, who to speak to, and who not to, what to allow into my days. Each choice was small, and together they formed something durable. I noticed how little drama was required to feel alive. A conversation that stayed honest. A walk taken slowly. Work done without urgency. These moments didn't accumulate into a story. They accumulated into presence. I had stopped narrating my life. That was the most radical change. Without narration, there was no hero, no arc, no resolution waiting ahead. Just experience, raw and ongoing. At first, this absence felt disorienting. Then it felt liberating. I saw how often people confuse intensity with meaning. How suffering is sometimes mistaken for depth. How chaos is mistaken for truth. I had lived that confusion. I didn't need it anymore. There were days that felt almost boring, not painful, just plain. And instead of resisting them, I stayed. Boredom, I learned, is often the threshold to something subtler. In that subtlety, I noticed patterns. How my body responded before my mind did. How certain environments drained me. How others grounded me. This wasn't self-optimization. It was listening. I understood then that maturity is not about knowing who you are. It's about recognizing when you're not present and returning. The urge to reinvent myself still appeared occasionally. A familiar itch. The desire for reinvention is seductive. It promises renewal without responsibility. I let it pass. I became less interested in possibility, more interested in continuity, in showing up again, in keeping agreements with myself, in not disappearing when things felt ordinary. One afternoon, sitting alone, I realized something quietly unsettling. If nothing changes, I'm still okay. That thought would have terrified me once. Now it felt like relief. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Not from the world. Not from my past. Not from an imagined future self. This phase of life did not feel like growth. It felt like inhabiting what had already grown. And that required a different skill. Maintenance. Maintenance is rarely celebrated. It doesn't create stories worth telling. It doesn't signal progress, but it sustains what matters. I began to respect repetition. Not routine, repetition with awareness. Returning to the same tasks, the same places, the same people, without expectation of novelty, without disappointment. In the past, I had left things when they stopped expanding me. Now, I stayed when they continued to hold me. That was new. I realized that freedom is not endless choice. It's knowing what you won't choose again, and living inside that boundary. There are moments of doubt, not existential, practical. Is this enough? Am I settling? The questions surfaced. I didn't suppress them. I answered calmly. Enough for what? Settling compared to whose life? Comparison had lost its grip, not because I transcended it, because it no longer applied. I wasn't building toward visibility. I was building toward coherence. I began to feel time differently, less as a resource, more as a medium, something I moved through, not something I spent. Even loneliness had changed. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, sometimes welcome, sometimes heavy, always honest. I had stopped trying to resolve myself, stopped seeking closure. I understood that a life lived consciously remains open. And openness is not a flaw. This phase didn't offer lessons. It offered rhythm. And rhythm, I learned, can carry you further than insight. I didn't feel complete, but I felt here. And that, after everything, felt sufficient. Still, something subtle waited ahead. Not a crisis, not a breakthrough, a test of endurance, of whether I could remain present, not during change, but during continuity. That question lingered quietly, unannounced, patient. Stability has a weakness no one warns you about. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't break you. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It simply continues. After months of quiet consistency, something subtle began to shift. Not externally, internally. A fatigue that had no clear source. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't lost. And yet, something felt slightly out of reach. It wasn't dissatisfaction. It was saturation. The sense that every day arrived already familiar. Predictable in tone. Understandable in shape. Safe. And safety, sustained long enough, begins to ask a dangerous question. Is this all? I noticed how often I was tempted to provoke change. Not because I needed it, because I wanted to feel movement, to feel contrast, to feel evidence that time was passing. The old impulses resurfaced quietly. The desire to disrupt, to start something new, to abandon what was working, just to feel alive again. I recognized them. They were not new. They were rehearsed. Before, I would have obeyed. Mistaken restlessness for truth. Confused discomfort with direction. Now I paused, and that pause revealed something important. The discomfort wasn't asking for escape. It was asking for attention. I began to observe my days more closely. Not to fix them, to understand them. Where did my energy go? Where did it stagnate? Where did I disappear without noticing? I saw how easily routine can become unconscious. Even intentional routines, even chosen ones. Presence requires renewal, not reinvention. Renewal. I started asking quieter questions. Not what's next, but what am I no longer noticing? The answer was subtle. I had stopped listening deeply. Not to others, to myself. The stillness that once felt rich had become assumed. I moved through it without curiosity. That realization unsettled me, because it meant I could lose myself again, not through chaos, but through comfort. I remembered something I had once learned. Growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like attention returning to what you've normalized. I resisted the urge to dramatize this phase. There was no problem to solve, no identity to dismantle, no escape to plan. This was not a crisis. It was maintenance at a deeper level. But maintenance, sustained long enough, becomes invisible labor. And invisible labor exhausts quietly. I felt tired without being tired, unmotivated without being depressed, restless without being lost. There was no language for this state. That made it harder. I realized how much of modern life is structured to avoid this exact feeling. We are taught to escalate, to change jobs, to move cities, to reinvent relationships. Anything but stay long enough to feel continuity deeply. Staying requires stamina, not excitement. Stamina. I began to reintroduce friction deliberately, not chaos. Small disruptions, walking different routes, saying no to autopilot agreements, allowing conversations to go deeper instead of smoother. These changes were minor, but they reawakened something. Awareness. I noticed how often I'd been choosing ease over honesty. Not lying, just smoothing edges, avoiding discomfort. Even in a life built on presence, avoidance finds new forms. I sat with that truth without judgment. because judgment would have turned this into a performance again. There were days I questioned whether I had mistaken endurance for integrity, whether I was staying present or simply staying. The distinction mattered. I returned to the simplest metric I trusted. Was I awake in my choices, or merely consistent? Some answers surprised me. In some areas, I had drifted. In others, I was deeply aligned. The work was not dramatic. It was precise. I learned that quiet living still requires courage. Not the courage to leap, the courage to adjust, to refine, to admit when stability becomes dullness, and to respond without destroying what works. I stopped expecting fulfillment. That expectation itself had been exhausting. Instead, I focused on engagement. Was I engaged with my days, with my body, with my attention? Engagement fluctuated, and that was acceptable. Not every day needed to feel rich, but no day needed to feel abandoned. I allowed boredom to stay longer, not to punish myself, to see what lived beneath it. Often, boredom concealed grief. Grief for intensity, for momentum, for former versions of myself that thrived on urgency. I mourned those versions quietly, without wanting them back. There was relief in realizing I didn't need to optimize this phase. I needed to inhabit it. Optimization had always been a form of control. This phase asked for trust. Trust that depth does not always feel dramatic. Trust that meaning does not always announce itself. Trust that presence is enough, even when it feels unremarkable. Some days I failed. I dissociated. I numbed. I rushed. I didn't turn those days into evidence against myself. I treated them as signals. The real test of maturity, I realized, is not avoiding collapse. It's noticing drift early and returning gently. By the end of this phase, I understood something essential. Stability is not static. It is dynamic attention. Lose the attention, and stability decays into stagnation. I wasn't stuck. I was being asked to listen again, at a deeper frequency, and I knew, without urgency, that another adjustment was coming. Not a rupture, not a reinvention, a recalibration. The question was no longer who I was. It was whether I could stay awake inside what I had chosen. The recalibration did not arrive suddenly. There was no decision point, no night of clarity, no sentence that reorganized everything. It happened the way most real changes happen, quietly, while nothing else seemed to be happening. I began to understand that this phase of life required a different kind of strength. Not the strength to endure pain, not the strength to chase meaning, but the strength to remain present without reward. There is a subtle loneliness in continuity. When nothing is collapsing, when nothing is beginning, when life simply continues and asks you to stay with it. I noticed how deeply I had been conditioned to expect resolution, a sense of progress, a payoff, a reason why endurance would be justified later. This phase offered none. It offered only now. At first, that felt unfair. I had done the work, let go of roles, chosen consciously, integrated slowly. Surely something was supposed to come next, but nothing did. And that absence forced an uncomfortable realization. I was still waiting, not for identity, not for purpose, for permission to rest inside what already was. I realized that even presence can become a project. Even awareness can turn into effort. I had been doing stability instead of inhabiting it. So I stopped trying to feel anything in particular. Stopped checking whether the days felt meaningful. Stopped evaluating my inner state. That constant monitoring had become another form of control. When I released it, something softened. Not dramatically, but consistently. I began to experience time differently again. Not as something I needed to fill. Not as something I needed to justify, but as something that carried me. Mornings arrived without expectation. Evenings ended without reflection. I slept without rehearsing the day. Woke without interrogating the future. This was a numbness. It was rest. I realized how rare real rest is. Not distraction, not entertainment, not recovery for for the sake of productivity, but rest that doesn't need to be followed by action. The world didn't reward this kind of living. It barely noticed it, and that was the point. I stopped offering explanations for my choices, not defensively, simply because explanations were no longer necessary for me. If something aligned, I stayed. If it didn't, I declined. Without story, without justification. There was a quiet dignity in that simplicity. I had mistaken complexity for depth for most of my life. Now I understood that depth often looks plain. Fear still appeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer fear of becoming the wrong person. It was fear of wasting the steadiness, of abandoning it for noise. I saw how easily people confuse stimulation with aliveness, how often novelty replaces presence. I didn't judge it. I had lived that way myself. But I also saw how rare it is to stay, to keep choosing the same values when nothing forces you to remain awake when the environment offers no resistance. That, I realized, is where character forms, not in crisis, in continuity. There were days I felt flat, emotionally neutral, neither happy nor sad. And instead of panicking, I let them be. Flatness, I learned, is not emptiness. It's a pause between waves. I stopped expecting my life to feel right. That expectation had been a subtle form of dissatisfaction. Life isn't right or wrong. It's lived or avoided. I stayed, even when staying offered no insight, even when nothing seemed to deepen, even when the days blended. That choice mattered more than any revelation I'd ever had. Over time, something quiet emerged. Trust, not confidence. Trust. Trust that I didn't need to chase intensity to feel alive. Trust that meaning didn't need to be extracted. Trust that I could remain with myself, even when nothing was happening. I thought back to the earlier versions of me, always moving, always seeking, always resolving. They had believed that stillness meant stagnation. They were wrong. Stillness is not the absence of movement. It's the absence of avoidance. I realized that the deepest form of maturity is staying available to life without demanding that it perform. Letting moments be small. Letting days be ordinary. Letting yourself be unremarkable and present. There was grief in that acceptance. A final letting go of the fantasy that life would culminate in clarity. I allowed that grief, and then I released it. Nothing replaced it, and that was enough. I don't know where this life leads, and for the first time, that doesn't feel like a problem. I am not building toward an answer. I am living inside a question. If there is any wisdom here, it is simple. You don't need to escape your life to be alive. You don't need to reinvent yourself to stay awake. You don't need intensity to have depth. You need attention and the courage to keep offering it, even when nothing spectacular returns it. This is not the end of a journey. It is not a conclusion. It is a way of walking, quiet, sustained, human, and I'm still here.